the day the Council witnessed humanity's polite mode turn off in real time. If you are watching this debrief recording, then you already know how it ended. You probably read the summary, you saw the official statement, you know that humanity won, that the resolution passed, and that the Galactic Accord has been very, very careful around us ever since. What you do not know is what it felt like from inside the room. My name is Cale Morrow. I served as Earth's ambassador liaison to the Galactic Accord Council for 11 years. I sat through 417 formal sessions in the grand deliberation chambers of Valoreth Station. I submitted 231 formal motions, of which 69 were acknowledged without being acted on, 94 were tabled indefinitely, and 41 were quietly reworded by the Council Secretariat before being filed. I watched every procedural trick in the galaxy get used against me, my team, and the people I was supposed to represent, and I smiled through every single one of them. Not because I was weak, not because I was afraid, not because I did not understand what was happening to me, to my team, and to the people back home who trusted us to fight for them in this chamber. I smiled because I was following a strategy, and strategies require patience. Let me tell you about the strategy first, because nothing that happened later makes sense without it. When humanity joined the Galactic Accord 62 years ago, we did not arrive as conquerors. We did not arrive as a military power, though we were, by any honest measure, a military power by that point. We arrived as newcomers. We arrived late, smaller in interstellar terms than most of the other 14-member species, and we arrived carrying a reputation that made every alien diplomat in that chamber deeply, quietly nervous. They had watched us from a distance for a long time before we were invited to join. They had seen our history. They knew about our wars, our century of near-extinction conflicts, our very long and very messy process of becoming a single unified civilization. They were not afraid of us the way you fear a storm, something random and impersonal. They were afraid of us the way you fear a species that nearly destroyed itself multiple times and kept rebuilding anyway. That kind of fear has a different texture. It is more watchful, more careful. The strategists back on Earth understood this. They made a decision, one of the most important decisions in human diplomatic history, and they made it before I was even born. The decision was simple. We would be the polite ones. We would be warm. We would be helpful. We would attend every function, submit every form, follow every protocol, and absorb every insult with a nod and a pleasant expression. We would be the species that brought food to shared events and remembered the names of other delegates' children and asked genuine questions about alien cultures and never, ever lost our composure in a public setting. It was not weakness. It was architecture. We were building something, and the building required a long foundation. The other species interpreted our politeness the way they interpreted everything about us, through the lens of their own cultures. The Velkan, the large arthropod-like race who dominated the military side of Accord politics, saw our restraint as submission. In their culture, a creature that does not bear its strength when challenged has no strength to bear. They were not entirely wrong about many races. They were entirely wrong about us. The Korathi, the oldest species in the Accord, ancient and slow-moving and deeply condescending to every race younger than their own civilization, saw our politeness as the behavior of cultural children who did not yet know how the world worked. They patted us on the head, metaphorically speaking, and expected us to stay grateful for the privilege of being in the room. The Serene were different. They were small, quietly intelligent, and the most genuinely diplomatic species I had ever encountered. They did not fully trust us, but they watched us with something closer to curiosity than contempt. My counterpart among them, an observer named Yathna, was the closest thing I had to a real ally in those chambers during my first several years. She understood that humanity was playing a longer game than we were showing. She just did not know how long. Valoreth Station itself was enormous, a ring-shaped structure orbiting the neutral world of Keth Prime, built by the Accord over 2 centuries as a permanent home for its rotating sessions. The grand deliberation chambers sat at the center of the ring, a vast circular hall with tiered seating for each delegation, and a central floor where recognized speakers stood. The architecture was designed by the Korathi, which meant it was beautiful in a way that subtly reminded you how old they were and how young you were. High ceilings, cold light, stone-like walls that were actually a composite material that had been engineered to last 10,000 years. I sat in that room for 11 years and memorized every line of it. The Marin IV situation did not appear suddenly. It built the way pressure builds in a sealed system, slowly, quietly, and then all at once. Marin was a fringe world, far out on the edge of what the Accord called the disputed corridor, a stretch of space where the borders between several species claimed territories had never been fully formalized. Humanity had established 3 agricultural settlements there 14 years before I took up my post. Small communities, farming settlements mostly, supplying protein crop exports to 2 other human colonies further in system. About 400 people across all 3 families, people who had built their lives there. The Velcon had a survey fleet that operated through the disputed corridor. The surveys had been running for decades, and they were never entirely benign. A Velcon survey meant something different from what a human survey meant. For us, a survey was data collection. For them, it was the first step in a claim. 14 months before the session that changed everything, the Velcon survey teams began visiting Marin IV. First they came to document, then they came to question the settlers' permits. Then they found technical issues with those permits. Issues that had not existed before the surveys began. Issues that the Accord's administrative office confirmed in writing. And then 6 weeks later, quietly unconfirmed. The settlers filed complaints. Earth filed formal protests. The council acknowledged receipt of those protests and scheduled a hearing for the following quarter. The hearing was rescheduled 4 times. When it finally happened, the Velcon presented counter-evidence that I knew for a fact had been altered. I said so in measured language with citations. The council chair, a Quarathi named Eth Voran, noted my objection for the record and then called for a recess. When the session resumed, my evidence had been reclassified as under review, which meant it could not be formally cited until the review was complete. The review had no stated timeline. I smiled. I submitted a formal inquiry about the review timeline. I received a form response. 3 months after that, the first settlement on Marin IV was dismantled. The settlers were given 48 hours to leave and told their permits had been permanently suspended under a clause of the Accord's land use charter that had never been applied to human settlements before and had, to my knowledge, never been applied to any settlement that was not already abandoned. The families left. Earth filed another protest. The council held another hearing, and this time they let me speak for a full 20 minutes. I was interrupted 11 times by procedural challenges, none of which were rejected by the chair. By the time I walked back to the human delegation suite that evening, the second settlement had received its suspension notice. My deputy, a young man named Owen Croft who had been with me for 3 years, put a coffee on my desk without saying anything. He had learned by that point to read the specific kind of quiet that I went into after sessions like that. He knew it was not sadness. He knew it was not defeat. He just was not sure yet what it was. I sat down in the chair by the window that looked out over the ring's outer hull, and I watched the stars for a while. Keth Prime hung below us, blue-green and indifferent, the way planets always are. I thought about the 400 people on Marin, about the crops they had planted and the buildings they had built and the lives they were dismantling into transport containers because a council of aliens had decided their permits were inconvenient. I thought about how long we had been polite. 62 years of smiling. 412 sessions of measured language and careful objections filed in the correct format with the appropriate documentation attached. I thought about what the Quarathi delegate had said that morning, in session, on the official record, while looking directly at me. He had referred to the displaced settlers as an acceptable ecological adjustment for a zone of high developmental interest. He said it the way you say something you have never had to think twice about. The way you say something when you are completely certain the other person in the room has no power to do anything about it. I finished my coffee. I looked at the stars for a while longer. Owen asked very quietly, from the doorway, "What do we do?" I thought about the strategy, the long game, the 62 years of careful, patient foundation building. I thought about everything we had been doing, quietly, without fanfare, while the rest of the Accord made assumptions about us. "We keep being polite," I said. Owen nodded slowly. The way young people nod when they suspect they are missing something important. He was, but he would understand soon enough. The third settlement received its suspension notice 7 days later. I was in a preliminary session when the notification reached my communicator. I read it under the desk, because acknowledging personal communications during a formal session was a protocol violation, and I did not give anyone a reason to cite me for protocol violations. Not then, not yet. I put the communicator away. I continued listening to a 40-minute presentation by the Velcon delegation about the strategic necessity of expanding survey operations in the disputed corridor. I took notes. I raised 2 procedural questions at the appropriate time. I was, by every observable measure, a composed and professional diplomat doing his job. What was happening inside me during those 40 minutes is not something I am going to fully describe in this debrief. It would not be useful information for the record. What matters is that it did not show, and I made a decision about that, sitting in that chair, holding a stylus and watching a Vulcan delegate gesture at a holographic map of territory that contained the ruins of 3 human communities. I made a decision about how long the politeness was going to continue, and under what conditions it would stop. The conditions were specific. They were not emotional. That is important to understand. The decision was not made in rage, which fades, or grief, which clouds judgment. It was made in the same cold, clear-eyed space where every significant human decision gets made. The space you find after you have processed the emotion and set it aside and asked yourself what is actually true and what is actually possible. What was actually true? The Accord's procedural system was being used as a weapon against us, and the people wielding it believed we would keep accepting it indefinitely. What was actually possible? A great deal more than they knew. I want to tell you about Yath first, because she matters to what comes next. She found me in the corridor after that session ended, which was unusual. The Serene did not typically seek outside conversations in public spaces. They preferred scheduled meetings with formal agendas. Her finding me in a corridor meant she had been waiting for me, which meant whatever she wanted to say was something she had decided not to put in writing. She fell into step beside me. She was shorter than me by about half a meter, with the pale, slightly luminous skin tone that Serene had under artificial light, and she moved with the careful precision her species was known for. Every gesture deliberate, every word chosen. You did not react, she said, in there. After the third notice, I was watching you. There was nothing appropriate to react to during a formal session, I said. Most delegates would have at least raised their voice. I looked at her sideways. We have had a lot of practice. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that is not a comforting thing to say. Morrow. No, I agreed. I suppose it is not. She stopped walking. I stopped too. She looked at me with those large, dark, serene eyes that were built for reading micro-expressions, and she read mine for a long moment. I let her. I had nothing to hide from Yathna. She was not an enemy. What are you planning? She asked. I am going to continue doing my job, I said. That is a non-answer. Yes, I said. It is. She studied me for another moment. Then she nodded once and walked away in the other direction. I went back to the human suite and spent the next 6 hours reading the Accord Charter from the beginning. Not because I had not read it before. I had read it many times. I read it again because when you are preparing for something, you do not rely on memory. You go back to the source. You make sure you have not missed anything. You find every corner, every clause, every mechanism that exists in a document, because you will need to know all of them. Owen watched me read for about an hour before he asked if I wanted anything from the commissary. No, I said. Sit down, read this with me. He sat down. He read. He was quiet for a while. Then, around the third hour, he said very quietly, Is this what I think it is? What do you think it is? You are finding every rule in this document that they have never expected anyone to actually use. I am making sure I know all the rules, I said. Every single one. Owen was quiet for a while after that. Then he said, okay. Just that. Okay. He understood now. Form of motion to reclassify Marin IV as Velcon Sovereign Survey Territory came 4 days later. It was introduced by Torak Vel, the lead Velcon delegate, a massive creature with a carapace the color of old iron, and a way of speaking that made everything sound like an announcement of something already decided. He introduced the motion at the start of a session, which was itself a small procedural aggression, because early introductions do not allow for preparation time from opposing parties. He knew that. He did it on purpose. I requested the floor to object. The chair granted me speaking time and then, over the next 40 minutes, allowed 6 procedural interruptions from allied delegations, each one fragmenting my argument, each one requiring me to restart, reframe, and re-establish my legal standing before continuing. I did so every time without hesitation, without raising my voice, without any visible sign of frustration. I heard one of the Velcon junior delegates murmur something to a colleague. I could not hear the exact words through the translation matrix, but the tone was unmistakable. It was amusement. The motion passed 9 votes to 4. The Serene abstained, which was Yathna's way of telling me something without telling me anything. The human settlements on Marinai were retroactively reclassified as unauthorized occupation of sovereign territory. Any future human presence there would constitute a formal trespass. I noted the vote. I wrote it down in my official log with the date and the vote count and the names of every delegate who raised their marker. After the session broke, Torak Vel passed me in the corridor near the east exit of the chamber. He was moving with his usual unhurried weight, surrounded by 2 junior members of his delegation. He slowed slightly when he came level with me. He did not stop, he said, without turning his head fully toward me, as though the comment was barely worth the energy of directing it at a specific person. Humanity argues well for a race that has no real leverage. It is almost entertaining, I said. I appreciate the feedback, Ambassador. He moved on. I stood still for a moment. Then I walked back to the human suite. I sat down in the chair by the window again. I looked at the stars again. I was very still for a long time. Owen did not put coffee on my desk this time. He stood in the doorway and watched me, and I could feel him trying to read the quiet. And I could feel him failing, because this particular quiet was different from the ones before. This one had a different quality to it, steadier, flatter, like a surface that has stopped fluctuating because everything underneath it has finally settled into place. I picked up my communicator. I opened a secure line to the Strategic Continuity Office back on Earth. I typed 4 words. They replied with 3 words. I put the communicator down. Owen, I said, yes, find me every session date for the next 3 months. I want to know which delegates have requested speaking time and what their stated topics are. He moved immediately to his workstation. He did not ask why. He did not ask what I was planning. He had been with me long enough to know that when I spoke with that particular tone, the explaining came later. I opened my notes. I began to write, not a protest, not a complaint, not a carefully worded objection in the appropriate format with the appropriate citations attached. Something else entirely. There is something that most species in the Accord did not fully understand about humanity, and it is not our capacity for conflict. Anyone who had looked at our history knew we were capable of conflict. That was never the mystery. The mystery was what we had been doing for 62 years while being polite. I need to back up slightly, because what I am about to describe did not happen all at once. It happened the way most important things happen, gradually, then completely, through a series of small decisions made by a large number of people over a long period of time, none of whom were thinking about it as a strategy in the moments they were making those decisions. They were just showing up and doing good work. That is the thing about humanity that even I sometimes forget to account for. We do not always need a plan. Sometimes we just need a problem and enough time. When humanity joined the Accord, we were, as I said, newcomers, small, late, watchful, and because we were watchful, we noticed things that older, more comfortable species had stopped noticing. We noticed which systems worked and which ones did not. We noticed where the gaps were. We noticed the work that needed doing that no one was doing, because it was unglamorous work, difficult work, work that did not come with political credit or formal recognition. And we did it, not because we were ordered to, not because anyone asked, because it needed doing and we were there. 14 deep space relay stations sat in the transit lanes of the disputed corridor and the 3 adjacent zone sectors. Every ship traveling through those lanes used them. Every communication sent across those sectors bounced through them. They were essential infrastructure. They had been built by the previous Accord maintenance program, which had collapsed 40 years ago due to funding disputes between 3 member species who could not agree on a cost-sharing formula. The stations had continued operating on emergency power protocols, degrading slowly, until a human engineer on a routine survey flight had noticed the power readings and filed a maintenance request. The maintenance request went unacknowledged for 2 years, so the engineer fixed the nearest station himself, on his own time. Using spare components from his ship, he filed a report. The report reached a human infrastructure office on the outer colonies. The office sent a small team. The team fixed the next 3 stations. The team filed a report. The report reached Earth's Department of External Infrastructure Development, a small office that most people in the government had never heard of, staffed by about 40 people who quietly cared very much about making things work. That office funded a full repair mission, then a monitoring program, then a permanent maintenance rotation. Within 8 years, humanity was operating and maintaining all 14 stations. We had not asked for formal recognition. We had not requested Accord funding, though we had noted in a politely worded memo that it would be welcome. We had not made it a political issue. We had just fixed the things that were broken because they needed to be fixed. The Accord's administrative records listed the stations as jointly maintained under a heritage infrastructure clause. The practical reality was that if humanity stopped sending maintenance crews, every one of those stations would go dark within a cycle. The Velcon's primary survey corridor ran directly through Relay Station 7. Without Station 7, their fleet communication latency increased by approximately 19 hours per transmission. That was not a threat. It was simply a fact about how physics worked. The medical synthesis network was a different story, and in some ways a more significant one. 3 species in the Accord had lost their primary pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity during the conflict period that had preceded humanity's entry. The Dreth had lost 2 of their 3 synthesis planets to a resource war. The Pelori had suffered a biological contamination event that rendered their main production facilities unusable for a century. The Seth Anner had simply let their programs collapse through administrative neglect over generations, the kind of institutional decay that happens when no one is paying attention. All 3 species still needed pharmaceutical compounds, complex synthesized compounds that their own remaining facilities could not produce in sufficient quantity. The gap was being filled, partially, by emergency Accord programs that were chronically underfunded and frequently delayed. A human biochemist named Dr. Petra Hollis, working at a research station on the outer colony of Varan 3, had developed a more efficient synthesis method for one of the key compounds the Dreth required. She had published the method, a small human pharmaceutical company had licensed it and begun production. Within 5 years, they were supplying 40% of the Dreth's medical compound requirements at a cost significantly below what the Accord's emergency program was. Charging, the company grew. They hired Dreth biochemists and learned to synthesize Dreth-specific compounds that no human had been able to produce before. They contracted with a Pelori distribution network, which was one of the most efficient logistics operations in the sector. They hired a Seth Anner research team who understood their own species' medical needs better than any outside party could. Within 15 years, what had started as one biochemist's published paper had become a network supplying essential medical products to 3 non-human species, employing members of those species, and generating the kind of economic interdependence that is very, very difficult to untangle once it has been running for a generation. None of it was political. All of it was human. The jump point cartographic data is perhaps the most striking example, because of the sheer scale of it. Jump point navigation is the foundation of interstellar travel in our part of the galaxy. The stable transit points that allow ships to move between systems at speeds that make an interstellar civilization possible. Mapping them is technically demanding, time-consuming, and expensive, and the results once obtained are enormously valuable. Most species guard their cartographic data carefully. They share what they must and protect what they can. Humanity mapped everything and gave it away, not all at once, not as a grand gesture, one survey at a time over 40 years. Hundreds of human survey ships logging the positions and stability ratings of jump points throughout the sector, and then filing that data with the Accord's public navigational archive, because it was useful, because other ships needed it, because the archive was incomplete and incomplete archives cause accidents and accidents kill people, including human people, and so the practical thing was to fill in the gaps. 17 transit lanes that would be essentially unnavigable without that data. 17 lanes that every species in the Accord used regularly. The data had been submitted to the public archive. It was free to use. It was also, if you pulled the submission records, entirely sourced from human survey missions. I had known about these things for years. I had never raised them in session. There was no need to. They were simply facts about the world, background conditions, the furniture of the Accord's functioning. What the Strategic Continuity Office had done, 11 months before the Marin IV crisis reached its worst point, was sit down and write all of it out in one document, not as a threat, as an inventory. The document was called Post-Accord Options Assessment Volume 1. It was not a war plan. It was not a declaration of anything. It was a clear-eyed accounting of every way in which humanity had become, quietly and without fanfare, load-bearing infrastructure for the Accord's daily operation. It listed what we provided, what would change if we restructured our external commitments, and over what timeline those changes would occur. I read it the night after the Marin IV reclassification vote. I read it twice. I knew most of the contents already. Seeing it assembled in a single document had a different effect than knowing the pieces separately. It was like the difference between knowing a forest has many trees and standing at the edge of the forest and looking at the whole of it at once. I thought about the Velcon corridor, Station 7, 19 hours of communication latency. I thought about the 3 species who had voted with the Velcon on the reclassification, the Dreth, the Pelori, the Seth Anner. I thought about the medical synthesis network, the pharmaceutical contracts, the Pelori distribution network that human companies had built alongside Pelori partners over 15 years. I did not feel satisfaction exactly. It was more precise than satisfaction. It was clarity. The clarity of a person who has been playing a game for a very long time and has just seen, For the first time, the full board. I sent Owen to request speaking time for the following session. 20 minutes, formally reserved under Article 4, Clause 7 of the Accord Charter, which guaranteed every member species the right to full floor address on matters of vital interest to their population. The chair's office confirmed the reservation. It was, of course, completely routine, completely procedural. There was nothing about the reservation that would have told anyone what was coming. That was the point. I spent the next 4 days preparing, not drafting emotional arguments, not writing appeals to the council's sense of fairness, which I had tried before, to no effect. I prepared the way an engineer prepares before presenting a structural analysis, data, sequence, precision, every point sourced and timestamped and cross-referenced. Owen worked alongside me for most of those 4 days. On the third day, he stopped what he was doing and sat quietly for a moment, looking at the screen in front of him. "Cale," he said. "Yes? They really do not know what is in this document." "No," I said. "They have had 62 years to look." "Yes." He was quiet again. Then he said, "Why did we wait so long?" I turned in my chair and looked at him. He was young Owen. He had joined my team fresh from the diplomatic corps training program, full of genuine idealism and a very thorough knowledge of accord law. He had been watching me absorb insults and file careful objections for 3 years. He deserved a real answer. "Because we were learning the system," I said. "Every session, every procedure, every rule in that charter. We needed to know it better than the people who built it. You cannot use something precisely until you understand it completely. And you cannot understand it completely while you are using it to fight. You have to watch first. You have to learn. And you have to be patient enough not to move until you are ready." He looked at me for a long moment. "And we are ready now." It was not a question. "We are ready now." I went back to my notes. Outside the window, Keth Prime turned slowly in the light of its star, blue and green and entirely indifferent, and somewhere out past it, in the fringe of the disputed corridor, 3 sets of foundations were all that was left of 400 people's homes. I wrote for another 3 hours. When I was finished, I read it back once, made 2 small corrections, and closed the document. It was ready. The morning of the session, I arrived at the deliberation chamber early. This was not unusual. I was generally one of the first delegates to arrive, another small habit built over years, because arriving early meant seeing who was already there, and who came in with whom, and who avoided whose eyes, in the corridor before a session. Those observations, accumulated over hundreds of sessions, had taught me more about the true political landscape of the Accord than any official briefing document ever had. That morning, Torak Vel arrived with 3 members of his delegation instead of his usual 2. His posture was the same as always, unhurried, solid, a creature completely certain of its own weight in any room it entered. He did not look at me when he came in, which was also usual. The Korathi chair, Ethvorin, arrived next and took his position at the head of the chamber. He was ancient, even for a Korathi, and he moved with the slowness of something that had been in positions of authority for so long that urgency had become foreign to him. He had been chair for 11 years of my posting, and in that time I had watched him dismiss 219 human motions with a variety of creative procedural arguments and a consistent expression of courteous indifference. He glanced at me when he settled into his chair. I gave him a small professional nod. He returned it. Routine, the chamber filled. The session was called to order. 2 pieces of standard business were addressed first: a routine logistics contract renewal and a boundary marker maintenance schedule, both of which passed without discussion. I sat and waited. When my speaking time was called, I stood, straightened my jacket, and walked to the central floor. I began by thanking the council. I thanked them for 62 years of partnership. I thanked them specifically by session, citing 12 significant moments in Accord history, where human delegates had worked collaboratively with other species to resolve shared challenges. I cited the agreements by their official names and the dates they were signed. I noted the names of the human delegates who had worked on each one, because they deserved to be named. I spoke warmly. I spoke with genuine feeling, because it was genuine. 62 years of working within the Accord, of trying to build something real and useful here, was worth something, and I meant the acknowledgement. The chamber was attentive, politely so, the way you are attentive to someone giving a long, unremarkable opening. Then I changed direction. I said, I want to provide the council with some information that I believe will be useful for its ongoing decision-making. I will be drawing from a range of sources, all of which I am happy to submit to the record. I ask only that the chair allow me to complete my presentation before opening the floor to procedural questions, as the information is sequential and its significance is best understood in full context. The chair said that was acceptable. I pulled up my first display, relay station network, 14 stations, locations, construction dates, current operational status, and the entity responsible for their maintenance and continuous operation. Every station, every data point, timestamped and sourced. I did not say anything dramatic about it. I simply presented the facts. I noted that these stations served every member species in the Accord and that their operational continuity was essential to communication and navigation across 17 major transit lanes. I then showed the projected impact on those transit lanes if the maintenance program were suspended for a single cycle. Latency increases, navigation blind spots, communication delays. I showed which specific lanes would be most affected, and I showed on the same map which species' primary fleet corridors ran through those lanes. Torqueville's corridor was highlighted in amber. Station 7 glowed in the center of it. I did not say anything about this. I moved on. I presented the medical synthesis network, the history, the coverage, the 3 species currently dependent on human-produced pharmaceutical compounds for essential medical supply chains. I showed the volume of product, the distribution infrastructure, the employment figures, the research partnerships. I noted that any restructuring of human external commitments would naturally require a recalibration of these programs, and that I wanted the Council to have this information for planning purposes. I paused at this point to ask if the chair had any procedural questions before I continued. He did not. I moved to the jump point data. I displayed the 17 transit lanes. I showed the submission records from the Public Navigational Archive, every entry sourced to a specific human survey mission, dated, cataloged. I noted the navigational status of each lane prior to the data being submitted, most of them incomplete or unmapped, and their status afterward. I said, this data is of course already in the public archive and freely available to all member species. I am simply providing the Council with context about its origins, as I believe provenance is useful information. I was on minute 11 of my 20 minutes. I was nowhere near finished. I presented the security contract for Valorith Station itself, the contract that had been quietly renewed every 3 years for 18 years without being examined closely, the contract that placed a human security firm in operational control of the station's physical security infrastructure. I showed the contract terms. I showed the renewal history. I noted that the contract was due for its next renewal review in 4 months. The chamber was very quiet. Not the polite, attentive quiet of the opening. A different kind of quiet. The kind that happens when a room full of intelligent creatures is rapidly reassessing everything it thought it understood about a situation. I looked at the Dreth delegate. I looked at the Pelori delegate. I looked at the Sethaner delegate. All 3 had voted with the Velkan on the reclassification of Marinavi 4 days ago. All 3 were looking at the medical synthesis display that was still showing on the chamber's secondary screens. I did not say anything directly to them. There was no need. Torqueville interrupted. He could not use a procedural challenge for this, because I had preempted procedural challenges by invoking my full-floor address rights correctly, which meant interruptions required the chair's approval, and the chair had approved none. So he simply spoke loudly across the floor, without recognition. "Is this a threat?" he said. The chamber went quieter still, if that was possible. I looked at him. He was staring at me with the full weight of his attention, which was considerable. His carapace was rigid. Every one of his secondary limbs was still. I recognized the posture from briefings I had read about Velkan behavioral signals. It was a display of challenged authority. I said calmly, "No, Ambassador. A threat implies I am uncertain about the outcome. I am simply providing the Council with factual information that is relevant to our shared operational context. I want everyone in this room to have a complete picture before making decisions that affect all of us." He said nothing. He continued to look at me. I held his gaze without difficulty, because there was nothing to be uncertain about. I turned back to the floor and continued. I presented the full case record of the Marinavi situation. Every filing, every hearing, every procedural action taken from the first Velikon survey through the reclassification vote 4 days ago. I presented the timeline of the permit challenges and the specific dates on which the Accord's administrative records had been altered, which I could demonstrate through archived document comparisons I had been quietly collecting for 7 months. I named the dates. I cited the article numbers of the Accord Charter that had been violated in the processing of our objections. I cited each one individually. There were 9 of them. The chair attempted at this point to call my address out of order on the grounds that I was making allegations against the administrative process. I cited, immediately and without pause, Article 12, Clause 3 of the Charter. which protected a member delegate's right to present documented evidence of procedural irregularity without interruption during a full floor address. I asked the chair to identify which specific subclause of which specific charter article he believed my current statement violated. He was quiet for a moment. He said that I could continue. I continued. With 4 minutes remaining in my time, I said, I am formally notifying this council that humanity is invoking Article 7, Clause 19 of the Accord Charter. There was a sound in the chamber. Not a word, not a gasp, more like a shift in the quality of the air, a change in pressure. Several delegates looked at each other. A few were pulling up the charter on their displays, scrolling to Clause 19, reading it for perhaps the first time. Article 7, Clause 19. The Foundational Review Mechanism. A provision that had been written into the original charter and never used in 62 years of Accord operation. It required a full council review of any legislation passed in the previous cycle if a member species could demonstrate, with documented evidence, that the legislation had been passed through procedural malfeasance. The vote to invoke the review required only a simple majority of non-involved parties, meaning parties other than the species making the claim and the species being challenged. 7 member species were non-involved. I needed 4 of them. I had already counted. Yathna, the serene observer, raised her marker within 3 seconds of the call going to the floor. She did not look at me when she did it. She simply raised it, quickly and cleanly, and set it down. 2 more votes came within a minute. Then a 4th, from a small species called the Venari, who had never aligned publicly with the human delegation before, and who would later tell me, in a private conversation I will not fully recount here, that they had been watching the Marin IV situation for a year and had been waiting to see what we would do. 5 votes total. The mechanism was invoked. There were procedures that followed, formal confirmations, the appointment of an independent review panel, the suspension of the reclassification motion pending review. I participated in all of them with my usual professional accuracy. When the session finally broke and the chamber began to empty, I stayed at the central floor for a moment. I was writing something in my notes, or appearing to. Actually, I was watching the room. The Dreth delegate and the Pelori delegate left together, speaking quietly. They did not look in my direction. The Sethaner delegate passed close to me on his way out and paused for exactly 2 seconds. He did not say anything, he moved on. The chair, Ethforan, spent a long time gathering his materials. He looked older than usual, somehow, or perhaps I was seeing him differently. Torak Vel left last except for me. He walked past the central floor with his 2 junior delegates behind him. He was moving with the same unhurried weight as always, but something about the set of his carapace was different. Suppler. Not the posture of challenged authority anymore. Something else. He came level with me, he did not speak. I gave him a small nod, very polite. He moved on. Owen met me at the chamber door. He looked as though he had been holding his breath for the last hour, and had only just remembered to exhale. He did not say anything immediately. We walked together down the corridor toward the human suite. After a while, he said, "That was extraordinary." "It was accurate," I said. "The extraordinary part was that no one had looked at the information before." He nodded slowly. "What happens now?" "The review panel meets. They examine the record. They issue a finding. The Accord process works exactly as it was designed to work. And Marinavi?" I was quiet for a moment, outside the corridor windows. The stars were the same as they always were. Patient, indifferent, enormous. The people who built their lives there deserve to have them restored. I said, that is what this was always about. The review panel took 11 weeks. 11 weeks of procedural sessions, evidence submissions, testimony from witnesses both inside the council and outside it, and the slow, careful work of building an official record that would be impossible to challenge. I participated in every session. I submitted documentation with the same methodical precision I had been applying for 11 years. I answered every question from the review panel directly and without elaboration beyond what was requested. I did not grandstand. I did not make speeches. I did not do anything that could be interpreted as performance. I was polite throughout. Owen would later say that watching me during the review period was unsettling in a way he struggled to explain. I seemed, he said, completely at rest. Not relaxed, exactly. More like a machine that has been running at reduced output for a very long time and has finally been given the load it was. Built to handle, fully engaged. No excess energy spent on anything that was not directly relevant to the task. I think that is a fair description. The panel's finding came on a morning in early session cycle, presented by the independent reviewer in the formal language of Accord legal process. I will not transcribe the full document here. The relevant parts are these. Procedural malfeasance was confirmed on 7 of the 9 charter violations I had cited. The reclassification of Maranophi was reversed and declared void. A formal censure was issued against the Velcon delegation for the conduct of their survey operations and the manipulation of the Accord's administrative records. Reparations were to be assessed and issued to the affected settlers within 2 cycles. The chamber was quiet when the findings were read. Not the uncomfortable, pressurized quiet of a room that has been surprised. Something else. The quiet of a room that has been corrected and knows it. I sat with my hands folded on the table in front of me and listened to every word. When the last word was read, I wrote the date in my notes. The same notation I had made for 417 other sessions. Factual, precise. Just the date and a brief summary. The human settlement reconstruction teams had been on standby for 10 days by that point. They arrived on Marin IV 48 hours after the finding was issued, because that is what we do. We do not wait to be invited. We show up. We get to work. Afterward, in the days following the finding, several delegates sought me out for private conversations. This was unusual. I had been posting at Valorath Station for 11 years, and private approaches from non-allied delegates were rare. I had perhaps 4 or 5 meaningful conversations of that kind in the first decade. I had 8 in the 2 weeks after the review finding. Most of them were, at their core, asking the same question framed in different ways depending on the species and the individual. Why did you wait? A delegate from the Venhari asked it most directly. He was young by his species standards, not much older in developmental terms than Owen, and he had the particular intensity of someone who was genuinely trying to understand, rather than simply filling time with conversation. Your situation on Marin IV was clear to any observer with access to the facts, he said. The procedural obstruction was visible. The malfeasance was documentable. Why did you allow it to proceed for as long as you did? I thought about the real answer, which was layered. I tried to give him the version that would be genuinely useful. We were learning, I said. Not just the rules, though that mattered. We were learning who everyone was. How they behaved under pressure. Where the real leverage was and where the apparent leverage was. You cannot know those things from the outside. You have to sit inside the system for a long time and watch it operate before you understand how it actually works as opposed to how it is supposed to work. He considered this, and now, do you feel you understand it? Better than I did, I said. Not completely. You never understand anything completely. That is why you keep paying attention. Yathna found me on the last day before the council's formal recess. She was in the corridor near the observation gallery, the long window that looked out over Keth Prime, which had become something like my thinking place over 11 years. I had never told anyone I came here specifically to think, but Yathna was perceptive in the way her species tended to be, and she had probably worked it out. She stood beside me for a while without speaking. The planet turned below us, indifferent as always. I voted yes, she said finally. Because it was the right thing to do, I know, I said. I also know it was not without cost for your delegation. No, she agreed, was not. We were quiet together for a while. Then she said something that I have thought about many times since. She said, when you first came to this station, I assumed that humanity's patience was a kind of limitation, that you were polite because you did not know how else to be. I waited. I understand now, she said, that you were polite because you chose to be. That is a much more significant thing. I looked at her sideways. She was watching the planet, not me. Her expression was the careful, settled expression who has updated their understanding of the world and is sitting with the change. Yes, I said, it is. She left shortly after. I stayed at the window for a while longer. I thought about what humanity is from the outside. I thought about how we look to species who encounter us for the first time, or who have watched us for years without quite understanding what they are seeing. We smile. We bring food to diplomatic functions, real food, food we have prepared ourselves from our own traditions and offered freely. We ask questions about the lives and histories of people from species we have known for decades, and we mean the questions. The curiosity is genuine. The warmth is genuine. The species who dismissed us over the years were not entirely wrong about that part. We are genuinely warm. We are genuinely curious. We genuinely care about the people around us, including people who are not human, including people who have been difficult or unkind. That is not an act. That is not the polite mode. The polite mode is the choice to lead with those things. It is the decision, made every morning, to present ourselves as we want to be and as we aspire to be, rather than as everything we are capable of being. The two things exist in the same person. In every human person, both things are there, the warmth and the patience and the genuine interest in the world. And underneath that, or alongside it, or perhaps, woven through it in ways that cannot be separated. Everything that 7,000 years of surviving against considerable odds has built into our character. The stubbornness, the capacity to absorb and absorb and absorb and keep functioning, the very long memory, the ability to sit in a room where every procedural trick is being used against you and smile and take notes and wait. Most species express their nature directly. What they are, they show. The Velkon's strength is visible. The Korathi's age and knowledge is displayed in everything they do. They are not performing. They are not strategic about it. They are simply themselves, fully and without reservation. Humans are also simply ourselves. The difference is that we have more than one self available, and we have learned, over a very long time, that choosing which one to lead with is not dishonesty. It is wisdom. A junior diplomat from the Serene Consulate, very new to the station, found me in the commissary 2 days before I submitted my debrief for the record. She had introduced herself to me at the previous session, and she was the kind of earnest, observant young person who reminds you of why the work matters. She sat across from me with the careful tentativeness of someone who is not sure they should be having the conversation they are about to have. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want to say first that you do not have to answer." "Ask," I said. "Were you angry this whole time? Through all of it?" I looked at her for a moment. She was watching me with real attention, the way Yathna watched things, and I could see that she was not asking for the official answer. She was asking because she genuinely wanted to know. "Yes," I said, "I was angry." She waited. "But anger is energy," I said. "It is not a strategy. The question is always what you build with it. You can let it push you into something reactive, something that serves the moment but costs you the long game. Or you can set it aside, not bury it, just set it to one side, and use the clarity that comes after it to do the work that actually changes things." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That sounds very hard." "It is," I said. "But most things worth doing are." I filed my debrief 3 days after that conversation. I am finishing it now, recording these final thoughts directly, because there are things that do not fit cleanly into official documents, and I want them on the record somewhere. Here is what I want the record to show. The Accord works. It is imperfect and it is slow, and it has been used as a tool of convenience by the species with the most power in it, as every institution ever built by any civilization has been used. But the structure is sound. The Charter, read in full and applied without manipulation, is a document that was designed to protect every member species equally. It can be made to do that. We proved it. The settlers of Maranai got their land back. Families who had packed everything they owned into transport containers and left the homes they built are, as I record this, unpacking those same containers and repairing the foundations and planting new crops. The engineering teams have been there for 3 weeks. I got an update this morning. The community hall in the largest settlement is already standing again. Torak Vel has not approached me since the finding was issued. The Korathi chair received me at the start of the new session cycle with a different kind of formality than before. Not warmer, exactly. More careful. More precise. The look of a person who has updated their model of someone and has not yet settled on how to calibrate the new version. I gave him the same small professional nod I have given him at the start of every session for 11 years. Owen has been promoted. He will be heading a new subdelegation that humanity is establishing for the outer sector negotiations. I told him the only advice I could give him was the advice I had been given before my own posting, which was to be patient, to learn the rules completely, to be genuinely good to the people around him, and to remember that those things were not contradictions. He said he understood. I believe he does. There are people watching this debrief who will take from it the lesson that humanity showed its strength, and the other species backed down, and that is the moral of the story. I want to be clear that this is not what I believe happened. What happened is that humanity was always this. We were this on the first day we walked into the grand deliberation chambers of Valorath Station, 62 years ago. We were this through every session where we smiled and absorbed, and noted carefully and went back to our suite and kept working. The strength was always there. The capacity was always there. The will was always there. We simply chose, for 62 years, which part of ourselves to lead with. And we chose politely, because that is what the situation called for, and because humans are, at their core, practical. We do what works. We endure what must be endured. We fix what is broken, and we help the people around us, and we build things that last, and we keep showing up long after every reasonable calculation would suggest stopping. That is what we are. All of it together, inseparable. The polite mode is still on, by the way. It is always a choice. That is the part, I think, that should stay with anyone who watched what happened in that chamber. Not the outcome, Not the vote count. Not the image of Torukvel leaving a room for the first time without looking entertained. The choice. Every morning, every session, every corridor conversation and document filing, and carefully measured objection, and small professional nod. The choice to be the best version of what we are. The choice to let patience do the work that force would do badly. The choice to show up, again and again, and build the kind of foundation that means when something finally needs to be said, the room is already listening. We will keep making that choice. But we will know going forward that the room knows we are making it. And that is a different conversation entirely.